Good afternoon. I'd like to welcome everyone to the Unsure About Getting a COVID-19 Vaccine, a Candid Conversation with an Expert webinar on April 28th, 2021. My name is Donald Moore, and I'm with the Virginia Department of Health. I'll briefly cover a few administrative announcements before we begin. Participants will be muted upon entry. Please refrain from unmuting yourself. Type any questions in the chat box. Participants who join by telephone who have questions should send their questions to eprtraining@vdh.virginia.gov. This webinar is being recorded and will be made available online. Your expert panelist for the afternoon is Dr. Tyson Bell, Assistant Professor of Medicine, Divisions of Infectious Diseases and International Health, and Pulmonary and Critical Care Medicine, University of Virginia School of Medicine. Director of Medical Intensive Care Unit, UVA Health. Your moderator is Dr. Wendy Klein, COVID-19 Vaccine Advisory Workgroup, Associate Professor Emerita of Internal Medicine, Obstetrics and Gynecology, VCU School of Medicine. I'll now turn it over to Dr. Klein.
Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for joining. It is my great honor to introduce Dr. Tyson Bell. As you heard, Dr. Bell is Director of the Medical Intensive Care Unit at UVA, where he's on the teaching faculty in the Divisions of Infectious Diseases and in Pulmonary and Critical Care Medicine, and is board certified in both. He's been heavily involved in COVID-19 community education, patient care, and vaccine rollout. Just very briefly, a little in way of background, Dr. Bell was raised in Lynchburg, attended UVA, then completed his medical degree at Columbia University, his internal medicine training and chief residency at Mass General, and then completed an infectious disease fellowship at the combined Mass General and Brigham program, followed by a critical care fellowship at the National Institutes of Health. Currently, he is also enrolled in the Executive MBA program at the UVA Darden School of Business. Dr. Bell is an expert in COVID-19 and is also a renowned educator. And we are really fortunate to have him share his expertise and his wisdom today. Dr. Bell, take it away.
Well, thank you, Dr. Klein, for the gracious introduction. I love doing events like this because I love educating and talking to people and sharing knowledge. And what I want to do today is share knowledge, answer questions about COVID-19 and the vaccine. This is certainly something that has been around us for over a year now, but I still think that information is coming in so rapidly, so often that it's hard to kind of make sense of what's happening and what's going on, what you should be doing. And so my goal here is to really answer a lot of these kinds of questions. So I'm going to start sharing my screen here and load up my presentation. Okay, and can everyone see the slideshow?
Yes.
Okay, all right, great. Just want to make sure. All right, so Dr. Klein introduced me. That's a little bit about me, and that's just one part of me, though. I think what you really need to know is what drives me. This is my family: my daughter Ruby, who's 3 years old, my son Elaine, who's 7. My wife in the background, Kristen, and her mother, Diane Scott. This is really what keeps me going. And I want to show that first and foremost to you all because, yes, I have degrees and all sorts of things that I've done. But at the end of the day, at the beginning of the day, this is who I am. And COVID-19 has affected so many of us in every way. There's no one person who hasn't been affected by this. But it has served as a reminder of what is actually the most important to us. And for a lot of us, it is our family, our friends, our loved ones, and our colleagues. So I wanted to start with that because it's really going to frame how I interact with you all. It's important also to talk about what I don't do. I'm not paid by a pharmaceutical company. I don't even like pharmaceutical companies. And while I'm appearing at this event, I speak for myself and my opinions. I don't speak for any government entity. So I wanted to just put that out there. These are my goals with you. You should leave this session feeling like you understand COVID-19 and vaccination better than you entered. And if that's not the case, then I'm not doing my job and you need to let me know that. I need to be accountable for you. Part of what's made this so difficult is that the information is not very digestible. Sometimes it's filled with medical jargon. I want to try to avoid that and speak in plain English in terms that anyone can understand. I'm going to be honest with you if I don't know something, and I'll be honest, with this, COVID-19 has been very humbling, and so we have to be very upfront and honest about what we don't know. And so if there is something I don't know, I'll just freely admit it, and I'll give my personal take on the public health guidance. If you see public health experts and the CDC and FDA, they're giving guidance, but sometimes, there's gray area around that, and so what I'll do is share my personal take on it and also share what I've been doing at home with my family when I advise. And while I can't give specific medical advice, I'll provide the same advice as if you were my own family member calling me, asking me the question. So I'm going to advise you all the same way that I would advise my own family and my friends. So those are just the ground rules before we get started. Now, to get to some of the common questions that I've received around COVID-19 at this point, coming to a few themes. The first theme is just background on the vaccines themselves. What is the actual difference between the Pfizer Moderna vaccines versus the J&J vaccines? What are the side effects? How in the world were we able to get these vaccines so quickly compared to other vaccines? A question that I've gotten several times. So we're going to get into all of this. So first to start, you need to crawl before you walk. So let's just go back to the basics. The coronavirus has an ability to cause infection by using what's called spike proteins to gain access to our body cells. So this is RNA, which stands for ribonucleic acid, and these are genes that allow it to copy itself and reproduce. Now, when it reproduces and copies itself, sometimes it makes mistakes, and the mistakes are what lead to what these so-called variants. Those are basically changes in the virus that come from its copying itself or attempting to copy itself. And we'll get to that later. But the spike protein that you see here in red is what really allows the coronavirus to enter our cells and cause damage. The spike protein sticks to our cells like a lock and the key mechanism. So when they fit together, the cell opens up, lets it in, and then it causes damage that way and reproduces, and then goes on to other cells in our body and causes even more damage. And that's really how the coronavirus has been able to take such a firm hold really on the world so far. Now, this leads into our conversation around the vaccines, and I'll start with the messenger RNA vaccines here. So the Pfizer and Moderna vaccines, they contain a messenger RNA to just make the spike protein. So notice there are many different parts of coronavirus. Spike protein is one of them. This is only giving a recipe essentially to make the spike protein. So it does not give you COVID-19. Now, your body recognizes that the spike protein is a stranger and it presents it to your immune system. So it kind of breaks it down, holds it up, and says to the rest of your body cells, hey, this isn't supposed to be here. This is what it looks like. Your immune system recognizes it as a stranger, which means it'll make an antibody response to try to target it, try to get rid of it if it comes back around. That's the whole name of the game. Now, this goes into your immune response. Your immune response creates these proteins that recognize the spike protein, and so later, if you come into contact with the actual SARS-CoV-2 or what the actual coronavirus is, you've got kind of a sneak peek of what it looks like, and your body can kind of jump into action and really get on it. And this little cartoon is just showing that right here with a cell that's vaccinated showing that spike protein, letting your immune system see it and make a response to it. And this is what happens when the coronavirus encounters someone who's vaccinated. These antibodies, some of them will actually block the spike protein and will not allow it to actually gain access to our cells. Others just make it easier for the body to recognize cells that have been infected. But at the end of the day, your immune system is primed and pumped and ready to go, and it can recognize the coronavirus before it can really cause damage and you do not become seriously ill because of it. And this is why it's been so important to try to vaccinate as many people as possible, because the protection ends up being quite good. Now, those were the messenger RNA vaccines. What about the Johnson & Johnson and the AstraZeneca vaccines? So These work slightly differently. These are linked to a cold virus, so the kind of virus that gives us the common cold. And it uses DNA instead of RNA. The DNA, it gives a message to teach your body to make the spike protein. It actually does work through messenger RNA eventually, but at the end of the day, you're getting to the same destination through a different route or maybe a different vehicle. So you're still going to make the spike protein. Your body still recognizes it as a stranger, holds it up. Your immune system makes that response, and then later you're protected. So you're getting to the same place, ultimately making that spike protein, not giving you COVID-19, and then your body gets a jump start if you do later come into contact with the coronavirus. Now, you've noticed that I've talked a lot about genetic material, RNA, DNA. DNA is what makes us who we are. And so a question I've gotten a lot is, well, will the vaccine change my DNA? And the answer, luckily, is no. The vaccine messenger RNA or the DNA in case of Johnson & Johnson, they do not mix with your own DNA. What I think about is an analogy. When you go into a bank, initially what you see in the bank is kind of the business part of the bank where you have tellers and people casting their checks and taking money out, and it's very, very busy. But the real special part of the bank is the vault, and you're not supposed to go into the vault unless you're really supposed to be there and you have business there, and you have to give your ID and all this sort of stuff before you can go back there. Our cells kind of work the same way. There's a big business part of the cell where all sorts of interactions are going on, but at the in the back or in the vault is where our DNA is housed. And if you're not supposed to be there, your body doesn't let that in there. So the vaccines do not gain access to our own DNA. It does not get into our special temple or our bank vault. And for that reason, it does not integrate or change our DNA. The ingredients in the vaccine actually get broken down very quickly after entering the body. So there's less concern for these long-term side effects. So you're not going to turn into this spike dude that I think this is a Marvel, one of the X-Men. But you know, that's not the spike protein that you're going to get. This leads into other questions I've gotten about the vaccine. So, you know, what else is actually in it? So, does it contain coronavirus? We've addressed that. Does not give you COVID-19. It also doesn't have any other viruses that have caused damage to humans. So, HIV, hepatitis. The Johnson & Johnson I mentioned is linked to a cold virus, but they actually make it so that it does not cause you to get sick. I've also heard about luciferase or this bioluminescent material that is inside of these fireflies or lightning bugs, depending on where you live. This is what makes them glow at night. And sometimes in research, it's used to kind of tag cells to figure out what they're doing or how they're processing things, but that's not a part of the vaccine material. So none of that is being injected into your body. There are no microchips or tracking technology associated with the vaccines. I think, you know, people who have cell phones, you know, that's much more of a concern for being tracked, but there's nothing inside of the vaccine that will link you to 5G technology or Bill Gates or anything like that. There are also no material from aborted fetuses that are in the vaccines themselves. So, you know, that's something I've also heard, but just not true. What's in the vaccines are the messenger RNA or the DNA that we mentioned, sugars and salts in order to keep it stable and protected when it's in our body, and a fat bubble to kind of suspend it and protect it all so that it can last long enough in our body in order for it to do its work. That's really it. So then the next question I get is, well, what's the best vaccine? And we remember back when Moderna and Pfizer released their data on their efficacy and saw this 94 and 95%. And I'll be honest, this was better than I thought we would have gotten for vaccines, which was fantastic. But we kind of latched onto this number and made that the bar for how we measure success, unfortunately. And so later when AstraZeneca came out, and I know that's not authorized here, but I anticipate it will at some point, so I'm leaving it in here. AstraZeneca and Johnson & Johnson lower efficacy, 76% and 66%. So if you ask, you know, anyone who's just looking at this, they would say, well, you know, why would I get a 76 or a 66% if I can get a 94 or 95% efficacy? You know, just looking at it, that makes sense. But I think the story is a little more complicated than that. And we have to, really dig into that to understand it. So my argument is that it's hard to really say which vaccine is better because they were studied under different circumstances. So on the right here, this is Usain Bolt. He's the fastest man in the world. This is during the Beijing Olympics of 2008, I believe. This is him winning the 200-meter dash. He set a world record by 0.01 hundredths of a second. Fantastic run, and he just dominated. He also won the 100-meter dash, set a world record in that. Undeniably the fastest man in the world. This on the left is him running, I believe, in Tokyo a couple of years later at the World Championships. You see here he's running in the pouring rain, and he runs a time that's slower than his 200-meter dash in Beijing. And so if you ask the question, has Usain Bolt gotten slower over the course of 2 years? I can't really answer that question based on these two races. And that's similar to the vaccines here. So on the right there, beautiful day in Beijing, nothing really going on. This is the environment that the Pfizer and Moderna trials were performed in. On the left here with the variants circulating, the Johnson & Johnson trial happened later. You have these variants, which we know can sometimes decrease the effectiveness of the vaccine, although it still provides protection. We'll get into that. So it's hard to compare them directly to one another. So at the end of the day, what we do know, the things that we care about, especially in the hospital, people coming to the hospital, being hospitalized, and people potentially dying of COVID-19, you get essentially 100% protection from that with the vaccines here. So Moderna 100%, Pfizer 100%, same for AstraZeneca and Johnson & Johnson. So at the end of the day, despite kind of these efficacy numbers that are different from one another, these vaccines are extremely protective when it comes to keeping you from getting very sick from COVID-19. And so I think for that reason, I wouldn't be very picky when it comes to which one I have access to. One thing that's kind of complicated this conversation are the variants, and we're not going to get too much into this, but I did want to just put out there, what these are. We said earlier that the variants are really when the vaccine tries to copy itself and it makes a change. Sometimes those changes can either make it more transmissible, meaning it's easier to pass it from one person to another, or it could potentially be more deadly. So B117 right here is the one that's likely, if it hasn't already, become the dominant strain or version of the virus that's coming across the United States right now. You see, but right below that, B1351, that's the so-called South Africa variant. That's the one that's been linked with some decreased effectiveness of the vaccines. Even though they're still protective, it has shown that ability that it could decrease that level of protection that you could potentially have. And so that's why there's this concern that even though we haven't seen a variant now that is broken through virus protection, we definitely have ones that are more easily spread. And we could down the road have that one that could potentially escape or become less effective for the vaccines. And that's why we really have to try to get as many people vaccinated as possible. It's in your best interest, but it's also in the best interest of keeping everybody else safe. Now this question, how do we get these vaccines so quickly? So Dr. Klein mentioned that I'm in a business school at Darden. I actually finished a couple of months ago. But one of the lessons I learned there is when you're making something, you get to have two of the following three things. You can make something that's good, cheap, and fast, and you normally get to choose two. So if you want to make something that's fast and cheap, it ain't going to be good. This is pretty similar to if you took your car to a body repair shop or something like that, and they say we're going to have it to you in a couple of hours. It's not going to cost you that much money. It's not going to be a good job, just not good quality. If you make something that's cheap and is also good, then it's going to take you a long time. It's not going to be fast. Now, this is usually the pathway that most vaccines take. Vaccines are not money makers for drug companies, and so when they develop them, they want to develop it as cheap as possible, and that means that they're not running their labs 24/7 to produce them. They're not hiring a whole lot of staff to work on them. So at the end, once they do the trials and everything, they are very good vaccines, but because they focus on making the cost very, very low, it does take longer to make those vaccines. And that's why vaccines typically will take 10 years. I think the record was 4 years before this for polio vaccine. So there's some concern that if you make this over the course of 1 year, how's that actually possible? But this is what we had. If you want something that's good and fast, it's not going to be cheap. And so this is the development pathway that the COVID-19 vaccines took. Operation Warp Speed poured $10 billion into vaccine development for the COVID-19 vaccines. And what that money allowed us to do, or companies to do, is run their labs 24/7, hire a whole bunch of people to work on this and buy the technology that they needed, the lab space that they needed, and really work on this in a way that you just don't see with vaccines. So, if we were able to pour 10 million into a vaccine, we'd be able to make them a lot quicker than we do. But the important point to get across is that the safety mechanisms and the way that we studied the effectiveness of the vaccines was not compromised. So we were able to stand trials up quickly, but we still performed them the right way to make sure that the vaccines worked the right way. The safety mechanisms in place that review the trials, that review the results of the trials, and then ultimately make the recommendation on how the vaccine should be used. Those are all independent agencies that are not on the government dime and don't really have an interest in trying to push something to the market that isn't safe and effective. And so the FDA, the CDC, the board review committees for the trials, they all stayed intact, and that was the exact same as for any vaccine or therapeutic that comes through. The money just allowed us to make it quicker and cut some of the red tape when it comes to the normal process for vaccine development. So I just wanted to clear that up, that this is a quick timeline, but it was for good reason, and the science and the safety were not compromised. These are just a comparison of the side effects. I've received this question many, many times because I think that it is something that people are concerned about. I'll tell you, I got the Pfizer vaccine and I did have some injection site pain. You can pretty much count on that. And after the first dose, it was just that. After the second dose, I had that again. And then I had some chills here, which you can see up to in a third of people, that lasted about maybe 15 hours or so, or something like that. I felt fine by the next day. My wife just completed Moderna. She had injection site pain and some fatigue with the second dose and felt fine the next day. That's pretty much how it's gone for these vaccines. There have been some people who had no symptoms at all. Some people who have had things like fevers and things like that. But the common theme, I haven't seen it really last longer than 1 or 2 days. And then after that, you get that level of protection. One thing to point out is that the reactions are a sign that the immune system is working, and that you're generating the response that you need in order to later fight off the real SARS-CoV-2 if you come into contact with it. It's perhaps the reason Johnson & Johnson looks like it could be lower in a side effect profile, maybe because it's one dose. A little unclear, but it does look like it's slightly better tolerated. But among my friends and colleagues, the experience is very similar. The common thing that everyone does have is relief that they're vaccinated against something that's caused so much problems and death and destruction in society. So that's the one side effect that's that's long lasting and consistent among everyone, being glad that they've been vaccinated. There are some special populations that we should talk about. So pregnant women and young women who are thinking about getting pregnant, definitely being one. This is one of the more common questions that I've received. And then, what's going on with these blood clots that we're seeing in AstraZeneca and the Johnson & Johnson vaccines? And then will there be any long-term side effects? So let's just go right into it. This was a study that was done out of Brigham and Women's Hospital. I was actually born there back in 1983. But this was a really good trial that showed that pregnant women who received the messenger RNA vaccines got an immune response that was very good, actually higher than what you would expect for someone who had been infected with COVID-19. So that's even more reason to get vaccinated. But this was 131 women, 84 pregnant, 31 were breastfeeding, and 16 were kind of a comparison group who were neither pregnant or breastfeeding. They found that the side effects were not concerning, about the same as what you would see in a normal population. But really exciting was that they found antibody titers in umbilical cord blood and breast milk. Umbilical cord blood is what goes to a developing baby, and breast milk obviously is what baby drinks for nutrition. So This shows that the protection that mothers get is given to the developing child, either before they're born and after they're born, which is very exciting news because babies do not have fully functional immune systems and they don't have that level of protection. So they depend on their mothers for that protection. And if you have protection from COVID-19, it's great to be able to pass that on to your little one. And then, just to reinforce, I already said this, but there are no concerning side effects seen. So no effect on the pregnancy itself, no side effects that were concerning when it comes to the after getting vaccination, and nothing that was seen long term. And this is the larger one that recently came out that's also very exciting. This is over 35,000 pregnant women studied who received the messenger RNA vaccine. I think this is a typo down there. I needed to get rid of that. But just 35,691, but very reassuring safety data. They did note that arm pain was a little more frequent in pregnant women, but the headaches, fevers, and chills and body aches were actually less frequent in pregnant women. There were no neonatal deaths, and importantly, no actual difference seen in the rates of things like preterm labor, miscarriage, pregnancy, or any other adverse outcome. Now, our big frustration at the beginning of talking about the vaccine was that it wasn't studied in pregnant women. They were intentionally avoided, for all sorts of reasons, but they were not included in these trials. So we've been waiting for data showing that this is safe in pregnant women, and here we have it right here. So, the number of people in the trials were in the 30,000s or in 40,000s range for the Pfizer, Moderna, and J&J. So this is the equivalent of doing one of these trials in just a population of pregnant women. So showing that it's safe in a very, very large group of women who are pregnant. So very encouraging data. It's continuing to be monitored to make sure through the CDC system, but we haven't seen any concerning signs so far. So very, very good news there. So here's the, basically what you have to consider if you're pregnant or considering becoming pregnant or breastfeeding. You have to think about the risk. And so we talked about the risk of the vaccine. We really haven't seen long-term side effects. It looks like it's tolerated. You get good antibody levels. But we know that COVID-19 leads to, for example, higher rates of miscarriage, higher rates of preterm labor, and then a higher risk of serious illness or death for pregnant women. People who have taken care of COVID-19 patients, myself included, we've seen plenty of pregnant women who are just sicker than we would expect from having a viral sort of illness. We're used to women who are ill with influenza or other viruses and may come in sick, but women with COVID-19 who are pregnant tend to be sicker, and we just noticed that even before the data came out. It's just something that we saw that was a little unnerving for us. Now, on the other end, the vaccination leads to protection for mothers, protection for babies, like I mentioned, and that peace of mind that that you're protecting yourself and you're protecting your baby when you're bringing them into the world. Now, at this point, the CDC program has followed over 94,000 women who've been vaccinated. There have been over 700 live births now among vaccinated mothers. And again, with the CDC program, no difference in rates of miscarriage, stillbirth, pregnancy complications, or neonatal outcomes. So again, encouraging data. And I want to give you some notes from the field, just some personal examples that I've come across. This is a quote at the top from one of my nurse practitioners. She says, as a first-time mom, it was scary to think about bringing a baby into the world in the middle of a pandemic. I couldn't think of a better way to protect my baby than vaccinating myself so I could pass antibodies on to him. So if you have children and have had that first child, you know that even if they breathe differently, you're rushing in to make sure, is everything okay? Is something going on? That usually disappears by the second or third. But think about bringing your first baby in the middle of a global pandemic. That measure of that peace of mind that she got from being vaccinated was something that was a great feeling for her. And then from my pharmacy tech was worried about potential fertility in the vaccine, which has not been any linkage seen with that. She says, I was initially worried about vaccines and fertility, but honestly, after I got vaccinated, I felt so great that my husband and I wanted to celebrate. Well, there's nowhere to go. There's nothing really to do. So now I'm pregnant. So don't say I didn't warn you that the lift of getting vaccinated might actually lead to pregnancy in some cases, which I thought was really funny. Now, I wanted to switch gears a little bit and talk about this phenomenon that's made up in the news recently, CVST, or cerebral venous sinus thrombosis, which is another word or a fancier term for a blood clot. These were reported initially with the AstraZeneca vaccine and didn't get a lot of attention over here because it's not authorized over here. But then with Johnson & Johnson, and when it was seen there, the FDA and CDC actually paused the rollout and recently resumed it. Initially, this was seen in, for the Johnson & Johnson, 6 cases out of 6.8 million vaccinated. That ended up being 15 cases that were seen, all in women, out of 4 million vaccinations given. Now, one of the reasons this was really important to get out there is because doctors and nurses see blood clots all the time in people, but the mechanism and how this blood clot forms is different than the usual sort of blood clot. And so that meant that in this case, it had to be treated differently and not with the usual blood thinners that we use called heparin products. We have to use something different. And it was important to get that information out there. And as I mentioned, it was more reported in women and actually younger women of childbearing age. So initially, these 6 cases were seen in women that were aged 18 to 48 or 49, I believe. And when they did a larger analysis, they found that there were a couple in women that were a little older than that, none above 65. But mostly seen in younger women. Luckily, still very rare, but something that was very important to know about just because of these reasons, a little bit differently treated. And so a lot of people, no one was happy about this decision, obviously. And I had people on both sides of the aisle who said, this is really rare. We're talking about 1 in a million. Why would we stop it? All the way to the vaccines aren't safe and we need to stop, and everything is trash. So like most things, the truth is somewhere in between that. So why even pause if this risk was so low? And here's this risk calculation to do right here. So the risk of death from this CVST or TTS, thrombocytopenic syndrome, same thing we're talking about here, ended up being about 1 in 1.3 million. This is specifically looking at the women who were vaccinated, 15 cases out of about 4 million vaccines given, still very rare. The risk of a young adult dying from COVID-19 is 1,800 in every 1 million. So you look here and see overall, you are much more likely to do well by getting vaccinated than worrying about a side effect. And just to put this into a little bit more context, this is my lightning dude right here. Your risk of actually getting hit by lightning on a yearly basis, this is from the CDC, 1 in every 500,000 people. So you are actually twice as more likely to get struck by lightning if you're a young woman than you are to get this complication from receiving a Johnson & Johnson vaccine. On the other hand, once you are vaccinated, your risk of death from COVID-19 goes down substantially. So 1,801 million, and I showed you the data earlier that the Johnson & Johnson vaccine is very protective against death and hospitalization from COVID-19. So for this reason, the vaccine pause did not persist. It ended up going on, and they actually reaffirmed that it's appropriate to use in any adult, anyone above the age of 18, male or female, young or old, because this risk is so low and the benefit is so great. They did add a warning label just to make sure that physicians and patients knew about it, because you do want to be able to do the right thing and have your treatment team know what to do in that rare circumstance that it could potentially happen. So getting critical information to physicians, collecting the information, and prioritizing safety ultimately is why I think that pausing was a good decision, allowed us to take a breath and then resume, knowing the full information. I want to quickly talk about vaccine and long-term side effects. As I said before, it is extremely rare to see effects that appear after 2 to 4 weeks with any vaccine. That's because they're broken down pretty rapidly in the body. Nothing is really seen in the medium-term follow-up, and I say medium-term because of course, these vaccines have not been out super long at this point. Vaccination started really the later part of at the end of 2020, so we haven't seen years and years of data. But the point is, we haven't seen with any vaccines these sort of long-term side effects that manifest years and years after the fact. But what we do know is that protection from COVID-19 side effects does favor vaccination. And if you've heard of long COVID or you've had it or a friend or colleagues who's had it, you know that people who have COVID-19, even if they don't get particularly sick with it, can have these long-lasting symptoms that go on for weeks and sometimes even months. And so it does look like the vaccines do protect against that. We've even heard reports of people who've had long COVID get vaccinated and feel some of these side effects get better. So, you know, if you're trying to avoid, you know, those sorts of brain fog and fatigue and respiratory problems that does happen in long COVID, you know, getting vaccinated to prevent you from getting that sick in the first place, you know, very good way to protect yourself. So, you know, basically the vaccines are kind of like UPS. They go to the right address, which your body cells that make the spike protein. They deliver their package, the messenger RNA, and then your body breaks it down. And just like UPS, it goes away. So the concern that there's something that's going to stick around, get into your DNA and change something down the road and cause this long-term side effect, not really the case just because of how the vaccines work and how rapidly they break down. And now, what about life after vaccination? And what can I do? And you know, what are we actually protected from? And this information changes so rapidly that actually, after submitting these slides a couple of days ago, or even yesterday, something has changed, and we'll get to that. So we'll get to some of these questions next. You know, first, are we having an effect so far from the vaccine? So if you look at this graph right here, this is the plot from the CDC of our cases. So you know, high up here, this was over the winter holidays. We saw really very high cases, over 200,000 per day. We're down now below 50,000 for the first time in 4 weeks, and I think this probably reflects a few things. There is a seasonal nature to the coronaviruses, but also we vaccinated a lot of people, people over 18. Over half of those have been vaccinated at this point. Over 80% of those who are 65 and above, who we knew were very at risk for death from COVID-19. We combined that with natural immunity, people who've had COVID and have some antibodies. You see that, you know, the virus has a little bit more difficulty circulating. At the same time, it hasn't continued to go, you know, down to that level that we actually feel comfortable. You know, I don't like 50,000. That's still too high. So we've got the variants circulating that are more easily spread from person to person. And though the vaccines are protective, it does mean that more people can get sick. And we're seeing younger people getting sick from COVID-19, including, you know, in my ICU right now. Once I'm done here, I'm going to walk out the room and address and help my fellow with a patient who's very young with COVID-19 and very sick. So I think these two competing things are kind of why we canceled out, and we're kind of in that lower range, still not very comfortable, but not having this large surge that we saw in Europe and places like India right now. We do have good data that vaccination can prevent transmission. So this was a study of for 4,000 healthcare personnel and first responders who were vaccinated with the messenger RNA vaccines. Most of these studies are with the messenger RNA vaccines because they did come out earlier. So we were able to do these sort of post phase 3 trial studies. But they found that those who are fully vaccinated, so that means it's been at least 2 weeks from your second dose, were 90% less likely to get infected. Now, importantly, they were checking for people who had symptoms and people who did not have symptoms. So you were followed over time, and every week you got a swab sent, regardless of how you felt. And so this was good data showing that even for those who don't have symptoms, you are less likely to have COVID-19. And that means that we're less likely to pass it on because we know that people who do not have symptoms or before they develop symptoms, that's been a major driver of the pandemic, being able to pass it to someone before you even know that you're sick. That's one of the reasons why this can really explode out of control. But the vaccines provide protection against that. So in addition to protecting yourself, you're protecting others from getting sick from COVID-19, those around you, your loved ones. This is a list of what you can do after vaccination, and I need to expand this because it has changed. But when you're visiting people that are indoors wearing a mask and physical distancing, you can visit people who are fully vaccinated without wearing a mask, and also people that are at low risk for severe COVID-19. So think younger, healthier people, and of course, you know, they would have to agree to that they would be comfortable with that. but you can be without a mask around those people as well, knowing that that risk, although it's not 100%, it's very, very low to pass COVID-19 on. They still want you to take precautions when you're in the public. So if you're around a lot of people, wear a mask. If you have multiple households coming together, wear a mask. And then recently, just fresh from yesterday, if you are fully vaccinated and you're outdoors, you can go without a mask on around other people. If you are in a crowded space or around a lot of people, still put that mask on. But a little more liberating when it comes to trying to enjoy the outdoors, getting into the spring and summer weather. I want to just put a couple of scenarios up here just to run through what this actually means. So if you are fully vaccinated, so 2 weeks out from Johnson & Johnson or 2 weeks out from your second dose of Pfizer Moderna, and you got friends or family from another household that are fully vaccinated, go for it. Go hard. If you are getting together with friends or family from another household and they're not vaccinated, but they're also low risk, so one other household with unvaccinated members who are low risk, as long as they're okay with it, you can also go for it, party it up. Now, if you are with friends or family that are not vaccinated and they are high risk, or you have more than 2 households getting together, so that means your household plus another household, if there's another household coming in, then that's a situation where you want to wear a mask. And that's just acknowledging that when many different households come together, the risk of transmission or someone from that household having COVID-19 does go up. And so there's a limit to how far to go with it. But this is good that we can have a little bit more getting back to things that we were doing beforehand, acknowledging that the risk is not zero, but it's very low, especially if people around you are protected and vaccinated. Travel recommendations also change. So domestic CDC recommends no testing, no quarantine on departure or return, unless it's required by wherever you're traveling locally. And the international still recommend the test and quarantine if the country you're going to requires it, of course, and then to the test before boarding a flight and then again after you return. But this is different for people who've been vaccinated because international travel is now something that's allowed or advised that can be done safely by the CDC. So if you're not vaccinated, they actually recommend to avoid unnecessary travel. The last part I want to address were some questions I've received commonly about children and COVID-19. Should you get the vaccine if you've had COVID-19? And spending time outside, I think we addressed that, so I'll just briefly touch there again. Luckily for us, in general, children tend to do well if they contract COVID-19. That's not an absolute, of course, nothing is an absolute, but in general, children tend to do very, very well. They are more likely to be infected if they are in close contact with an adult. So the usual path of infection for a child is an adult gives it to them rather than a child gives it to them. They are less likely to spread, especially if they're younger children. But older children getting into the teenage years tend to spread like adults, but still tend to do well if they're infected. We do have data from Pfizer vaccine results in children 12 to 15 that are very promising, 100% efficacy, side effect profile is very good. This group of children actually generated the highest antibody responses of anyone studied to this point. So their immune systems are very, very good at this point at generating that response. What about vaccination after COVID-19? Yes, the answer is yes. My mom and dad both had COVID-19 probably around late October, early November or so. And so when the vaccines became available, they were kind of in that period where you would expect them to still have some protection from COVID-19. And so they called me up and said, you're talking about, COVID-19 and everyone, but what should we do? We've had it. Should we go ahead and get vaccinated or should we wait or what should we do? And I talked to him, my dad's a big basketball fan. And so I told him, well, think about the Minnesota Timberwolves right there. Impressive looking team, right? But the problem is their record in the NBA is not very good. They're probably, I think they have the second best record in the NBA. So they're just not a very good team this year. Now, they're still an NBA team. They're still very, very good at basketball. If they played against me and a bunch of my friends, they would kill us. But it's not the best that you can do when it comes to high competitive basketball. So, I'm sorry if anyone's a Minnesota Timberwolves fan, but you just have to acknowledge the reality. this year's not going to be their year. Now, if you get antibodies from natural infection, you get a pretty good response. It's very, very good. It lasts, several months, and people seem to do fairly well. But what we know about the vaccine is that the response looks better. And so you can go from the Minnesota Timberwolves, pretty decent NBA team, but I want Team LeBron. Like, give me KD, give me LeBron, give me James Harden, Karl Anthony Towns, put them on a team. That's who I want. That's who I want to represent me. And so the antibodies from the vaccine actually target the spike protein instead of your natural response, which we kind of look at many other parts of the coronavirus. The vaccines actually let you target in on that crucial part of the coronavirus that really allows it to gain infection. So you're really going from something that's fairly good to an all-star immune response. And so you definitely will want to do that. Lastly, the great outdoors. I will still try to maintain distance if possible with others. I put a mask on best not possible, but if you are fully vaccinated, the CDC has released guidance saying that you can go without a mask in those sort of circumstances. So use common sense if you're around a whole lot of people, or if you're going in and out of places. Have your mask on you. I always still have my mask on me, even if I have my mask off, and even if I'm walking in the neighborhood, because you just never know. But we can kind of breathe some more fresh air. Thank you for your time. I want just to end with, where I began, with showing a picture of my family. All the adults here have been vaccinated, and just a feeling of knowing that I'm protected. I'm working in the COVID ICU right now, and one of the things that's weighed so heavily on my heart and my mind and my worry is that, I could have, been infected here, gone home, given it to my children or my mother-in-law who's a little bit older. But now knowing that they're all protected, that peace of mind is a very, 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 very big deal. It means a lot to me. And so what I want for you is to get the information that you need, and have what you need to make a good decision and get yourself protected and protect your family and those around you as well too, because this I'm just sick of seeing this virus continue to ravage our community. So I just want to end there and leave some space and time for comments and questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Bell. I would like to throw this out to all of our participants. This is a moment to ask your questions. There is a great deal of disinformation that is out there, and a lot of fear, because it's hard to know where the truth lies. This is a moment when you've got an expert in front of you who can answer your questions, so please don't be shy. If there is something holding you back, so here's one good question, Dr. Bell. Contraindications to getting the vaccine. If you're sick, or if you've had another vaccine in the last few days, can you address those questions?
Sure. So luckily for us, there are very few contraindications to getting the vaccine. So the CDC has advised that people who have known anaphylactic reactions. Anaphylaxis is a severe allergic reaction that happens right away. It can lead to symptoms like your throat closing, your lip swelling, your tongue swelling, and concern for breathing. That sort of reaction to any of the vaccine components, that's a contraindication. So those are the people who should not get vaccinated. There is an additional option. This was more seen with the messenger RNA. Again, very, very rare, luckily, but Johnson & Johnson could be available for those people. Outside of that, if you've had, in the common question I've received is, what if I have a history of severe allergies, like food allergies, seasonal allergies? That's not really what we're talking about. If you've had a history of those allergies and they have been severe, the recommendation is to go ahead and proceed with vaccination, but to be monitored for a longer period than the usual 15 minutes. So, for instance, my son, at some point when vaccinations open to 7, people in his age range, he has a history of anaphylaxis to food. Now we're going to get him vaccinated. He's just going to wait for the 30 minutes because of his history. He does not have a known history of reaction to any of the vaccine components, but because of that allergy history, he'll just wait a little bit longer.
I'm going to offer, if I might, Dr. Bell, Just to put it in context, the risk of anaphylaxis is approximately, for the mRNA vaccines, 3 per million. So the risk is extremely low, extremely low. And everybody is trained to look for those. Dr. Bell, there's a question here. If you're currently sick or if you've had another vaccine in the last few days, are those contraindications? Are there any others?
Right. So my advice for any vaccine that you're getting is to not get it when you're sick with anything. So if you have the flu or you have the cold and you're scheduled for a vaccine for anything, I would wait until you recover. The reason is you don't want your immune system to be fighting anything else when you're giving it a vaccine. You don't want it distracted by something else. You want it to be in tip-top shape, not stressed out, so that when you get that, whatever you're trying to protect yourself against with the vaccine, you can generate that full response possible. So for people who are currently sick, the recommendation is to wait until you've recovered, specifically for COVID-19, to wait until you've gone out of the isolation period, meaning that you've either tested negative or you've had symptoms long enough and they've resolved and it's been long enough that you can safely be around others because you've had that immune response and protection. So after that point, you can consider going ahead and getting vaccinated for COVID-19. But don't get vaccinated with anything if you're sick unless your doctor specifically advises you to.
And the question about not having other vaccines within 14 days, there's a question about, can you get other vaccines?
Yes, I believe that was a 2-week separation that they advised. Correct me if I'm wrong with that. Yeah.
Supposed to wait at least 14 days between getting, for example, a tetanus vaccine or any other vaccine and your COVID vaccine. We have a question here, very, very common. What should I say to a male or female who is worried about infertility stemming from the COVID-19 vaccine, especially those individuals who are not typically data-driven?
Yes, what I would say is out of the millions and millions of people that have been vaccinated, this is something that we haven't seen so far. It's also something that we wouldn't expect, knowing how the vaccine works, what's in the vaccine. I think there is some conspiracy theory that was put out there by a German scientist that there was some protein that was in the placenta that was similar to the spike protein or something like that. But it has just not proven to be true. There's no effect on fertility when it comes to the COVID-19 vaccines. Plenty of babies have been made despite the pandemic, and people getting vaccinated. And 90,000 pregnant women, they were all not pregnant before they got vaccinated. So there's just no concern there.
Another question is, and I'm happy to field this if you're not. Question about changes in menstruation cycles.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so this was that I've gotten a lot of questions about a lot of things. This is probably the first one where I was like, yeah, I don't know. I hadn't heard of it. So there are a couple of problems here. The first is that studying women's health and these specific side effects is just not common. And so it was actually hard to find data on menstrual cycles when it came to the COVID-19 vaccine. And so luckily, after doing some digging, you learn that there are many different things that affect your menstrual cycle. So the menstrual cycle is a complex sort of interaction between different hormones and the placenta, obviously, and many different things can throw it out of whack. So if you get sick with influenza or COVID-19, it's not uncommon for that to cause your menstrual cycle to change from what it usually is. And so there have been some reports of women who've been vaccinated who have a change in their menstrual cycle because part of the menstrual cycle depends on the inflammatory response. And so if you get vaccinated and you generate an immune response that protects you from COVID-19, then in some women that could potentially cause a change in the menstrual cycle. But importantly, it does not lead to long-term side effects. And the women who have reported that it eventually gets back to normal. But I think it runs along with knowing that getting infected with anything or having a severe response or taking a new medication can affect that complex, intricate balance of the hormones that feed into the menstrual cycle.
I will offer that I am part of a group. There's a group of OBGYNs who are also experts in COVID who are on Instagram, and this has been much discussed And there has been no verification that COVID disrupts menstrual cycles. Most women are aware of the fact that menstrual cycles are variable. We like to think that they're highly regular, but many things can impact flow and regularity. So there is absolutely no evidence, no data to support any impact of the vaccine. There are anecdotal reports only. So, and absolutely, as Dr. Bell said, no concerns about fertility. Many healthy babies have been born to women who have been vaccinated. More questions. Are there any studies on GI bleeds from the Pfizer vaccine? A client of mine received the Pfizer vaccine, and then 24 hours later, they had a GI bleed, and they have no history of such. Would you recommend getting a second dose?
Yeah, so this is a good question. I'll first start by saying that I have not seen anything that has linked the vaccines to things like GI bleeds or any bleeds whatsoever. So that's certainly good news. But the larger sort of point to get at is that when you're looking at side effects and things that happen, there's always a baseline rate, meaning that there are a certain number of people who will develop a GI bleed over time, or have a stroke, or have a heart attack, or what have you. And what you're trying to do when you're monitoring for a side effect of a vaccine, you're comparing the rates of whatever you're looking at to that baseline. So, for instance, my mother got Bell's palsy shortly after getting the COVID-19 vaccine. Turns out when we look into this, you find that there are people who get the vaccine who get Bell's palsy, but it's no higher than the rate of people who get Bell's palsy in general. And so when you have something that, it's linked potentially, but there's no signal there, then it's hard to say that this is caused directly by the vaccine. So in the case of these blood clots that we're seeing with Johnson and Johnson, there is it's a rare disease. It does happen in a few people, but they saw that it was happening in a few more people than they would expect just from normal circumstance. And that's what led to them stopping that trial. When it comes to things like GI bleeds, which are very, very common, I've almost forgotten how to take care of these because COVID-19 has kind of changed the focus a little bit. But before that, we had plenty of people who had GI bleeds, and aspirin, one in 2,000 people on aspirin will develop a GI bleed that require hospitalization. So they just tend to happen to people. And luckily, there's no linkage there. But because of that close proximity sometimes with the vaccination, people can sometimes think, did this cause the other? But in this case, I would say most likely not.
And I would like to give a good example. Recently, at a big vaccination clinic that where there are many large vaccination clinics being run by all of the health departments, a woman came in for her vaccine and she passed out, and it turned out that she had a stroke. This was 10 minutes before she was going to get her vaccine. There was no relationship whatsoever. And she, of course, got immediate attention. EMTs were on site. She was taken to the hospital to receive care. There was obviously no relationship. It happened before the vaccine. But think about it. What if she got the vaccine 10 minutes later, as it was scheduled, and then had her stroke? She was going to have it anyway. The timing of things can be very misleading. And so similar to this GI bleed, just because there is a temporal relationship does not mean there is a causal relationship. And we have to be very careful about blaming the vaccine. So yes, I think Dr. Bell and I would agree that this person should absolutely get her second dose. We are running out of time. Donald Moore, our administrator, are there any announcements that need to be made to the group?
If Dr. Bell is willing to share his PowerPoint, we will provide that to participants. But the webinar, as you know, it is recorded, and I will be sending an email out to all the webinar participants who join the webinar, and I will send out the link to where you can view this presentation again, if you so choose. And that's about it. I can show them the webpage, Dr. Klein, of what you like for folks to see. right here.
Great, thank you. And I want to thank Dr. Bell for another wonderful presentation. You are awesome. And thanks to all the participants for joining. I hope you will help us make sure that everybody gets vaccinated. So
Thank you
thanks.
everyone for coming and stay safe.